And we will now transition over to a roundtable. I'll turn things over to our moderator, Biko Mandela Gray. And just before that, I just wanted to clarify a few things about the Q&A and our format. So for the audience members, please do feel free to throw in any questions you have right now. I will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the roundtable. So if anything, any questions relate to what's being discussed, I will just kind of pull that in. Panelists can also feel free to bring in some of the Q&A questions if they also touch on the moderated roundtable discussion. And of course, we also have time reserved at the end just to address Q&A. We would love to hear from you, so please feel free to use that Q&A panel to reach out to us. And with that, I will turn things over to Biko.
Thanks, Linda. And I just want to say thank you, everyone. Everyone can hear me well, I think. I want to say thank you, everyone, for some incredible presentations, some presentations that were incredibly informative, some that were filled with like incisive political critique, and others that were offering profound critiques of policies, right? And so I'm thinking about all of these things in relation. I actually do want to begin with Howard's questions or set of questions. And I actually want to pose them to the Friends of Chinatown. You all have been doing this incredible work as it relates to futurity, as it relates to organizing both digitally and in person. And so what does it look like, or what's at stake in preserving heritage moving forward in terms of the future? I am rephrasing your question, Howard. So if you want to articulate it differently, feel fancy free. But if we can start there, I would love to begin with that question. And if before you all respond, if it's okay, I want to read this quote that came to mind in the midst of all of you all's presentations. It's from a scholar that I read. His name is Fred Moten, and he says this about Black life. And there was this powerful resonance that I heard throughout all of you all's presentations. And he says, perhaps Blackness is tantamount to another fugitive sublimity altogether. Something escapes, and the object vibrates against its frame like a resonator, and troubled air gets out. Troubled air gets out. And what you all have articulated in each of your presentations, Linda opened it up in terms of heritage and excess, is that there's something about Chinatown that allows for this beautiful troubled air to exceed the frame of policies and history, and even exceed the frames of like what we understand as recognizable forms of heritage. And with that in mind, I do want to pose again this controversial question to Friends of Chinatown to get us started. So you all have the floor, but I just want that troubled air getting out is just what's in my mind in terms of what we're thinking through here. The floor is yours, Fox.
I'll start and then hand it over to Shelley, because I think we both have thoughts about this. I'll quote Hanya, who's been super busy in the chat. Hanya always likes to say that heritage is the people. And so if you want to protect heritage, you have to protect the people fundamentally. And so in many ways, I think we could argue that a tenant union, or maybe affordable housing policy, or maybe, you know, disability payments need to be increased, et cetera, things that literally protect people's survival and lives will come with it, protect the heritage that those communities who are able to have long tenure, who are able to have relationships and build that over generations and not be displaced, would be one way of interpreting how to actually enact intangible heritage policy, if we were to think about it expansively. Shelley, go for it.
Yeah, it's so funny because I thought of the exact same quote by Diane, which sort of speaks to how much it sticks in our minds and what heritage really means to us. And so from my understanding of heritage, the scope of what it currently is in the province is really limiting to the spectrum of how we see heritage, how we talk about heritage, how when we share stories, it's contextualized in the narrative of heritage. And so I was actually thinking a little bit more recently about DC's Chinatown, which is an interesting story where what happened is there was a sort of organizing group or a business group that passed this policy where all signage had to be in certain languages when it was put up in the area. And so there's this lovely paper I remember reading where through reading the signages in Chinatown, you can actually sort of mark the different patterns of immigration depending on the type of script they're using, depending on the kind of font, depending on the way it's read, whether it's, you know, left to right or vertical or right to left, sort of speaking about different ways of semantic presentation of where you come from a cultural background. But what was sort of the takeaway lesson from that Chinatown is that what you ended up seeing were Starbucks and McDonald's that would just have their names in Chinese. And a lot of the elders and the community members who lived there were also pushed out as a result of that. So that's kind of an interesting conundrum in defining like what constitutes Chinatown. If it's not the people and it's just these signs, does that still make up our community?
Thank you for that. I want to bring Erica in as relates to this too, because it seems like we hear this sort of dynamic notion of heritage as it relates to people. And yet we also have this sort of history, Erica, if I understood you correctly, that notions of heritage from sort of international or multinational corporations or organizations are still sort of white oriented. Is there a way in your mind, and this is a question that I just want you to spitball with me, is there a way, and also Howard, I want to get you in on this too as it relates to Dragon Center, is there a way to sort of push against these white-oriented understandings of a heritage in order to foreground the people that I hear Fock talking about, in order to foreground the reality, the lived lives that are actually sort of affected and impacted? Or are we stuck in what we might call a politics of recognition, where we're forced to play another group of folks' games? Eric, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'm glad you asked that question, Biko. I'm getting to this point in my life where I don't want to play those games anymore. That simply using that word heritage is playing into the hands of those who hold the power and trying to like square the circle or circle the square, like trying to expand the definition of heritage. A lot of good people are doing that, and they're working really hard to document, to collect stories. Howard's doing, we collect stories, we try to identify other types of cultural assets. Like I work on commercial, vernacular, suburban buildings. Nobody cares about these buildings. Often the people in the community who are occupying, building, remodeling these spaces couldn't care less either. They're like, it's just a strip mall. And I do love it, but I'm gonna move on, right? And there's a very kind of pragmatic approach. So I've spent my entire career trying to explain how these buildings and spaces and sort of social relationships are legitimate. But at the end of the day, when you're communicating, it's just still so hard to understand how this could be heritage, like design heritage, or like the historical events, or like people with biographies. They still become sort of the kind of the main signs of heritage, even as the definition has become really big. And so it's not only like a mainstream or kind of popular understanding, but even within the discipline, the professions, it's still a hard sell. And I've gotten to the point where I don't think it's necessarily a useful tool anymore. And honestly, even if you're designated as a heritage property, it means very little. Like it basically, like if you're a registered heritage property, there may be like a moratorium or like a certain number of days where you can't just tear down a building, but it could still go, right? And there aren't any requirements to, keep up the building as it was to its sort of heritage value. Like it's actually very weak. And yet, why are we so obsessed with this tool that is weak? Except to simply reinforce, a very normative white centering kind of narrative of what is history, what is sort of heritage value. And I think, yeah, like affordable housing, deeply affordable housing, job training, health clinics, like more investment into parks and schools and different social services. Like maybe we shouldn't tether it to these terms. I don't know. I don't know what you think, Howard, because I love suburbs too, and that's really where my research goes. And when I think about Washington, D.C., to talk to Shelley, they all went there. They all went to the suburbs. And the funny thing is, as kind of repayment, in a way, DC actually built affordable housing in DC's Chinatown. But there was no one there because they had to tear down housing. And so they brought those people in, but then they died or they moved away. And it was really funny. It's sad, but it's like newcomers from particularly mainland China, they were sort of bussed into this public housing project downtown. They're like, there are no Chinese people here. We're stuck here. It's horrible, but it's the only place we can afford. And it was like this really interesting moment where it's like, here's this legacy project. And then there was this question of privatizing it, and then they fought against it, and it's continuing to be public housing, and it's a good thing. But it also raises a question of like, when the neighborhood changes that much, is it still Chinatown, or is it worth now investing where the people are going? But I don't know, maybe Howard, you can say something about this.
Yes, this is fantastic. Howard, it's on you. I'm passing it over to you.
Yeah. So I mean, like my first comment actually to this is that like I feel that the suburbs by them like as a piece is like kind of hit by a double whammy as well, in the sense that like nobody generally recognizes the suburbs as heritage because there's still this idea that it's a new place kind of in people's minds. And I think like the architecture itself also does not lend itself to that very easily, right? And so like in that sense, like we're kind of constrained even further, right? As a community living in these places. Not only is it that we have to deal with the legacy actually of this like sort of very white-centric planning, right? That came professionalization of white-centric planning that actually came here and created the suburbs, right? But we also have to deal with the kind of like the general ignorance actually that really like folks in, I would say, the planning profession, in the architecture profession, and also like, the very downtown centric politics that we have here in Toronto, actually just generally just ignores all of this in general. And so like we have to deal with all of that, right? As we're talking about, hey, like over here, we got an interesting story to tell. Can you listen to us for a second? So there's all of that kind of just like culminates here. And of course, like, we're facing like gentrification as well. Housing prices are not a heck of a lot cheaper out here. So all of those things are kind of like acting upon us. And so I would say that like it's I would love to like actually, because the current power dynamics don't actually really allow for us to be able to get back to Biko's question, for us to actually push back against this. So I'd like to actually just change those politics altogether. And I think that part of it actually is redefining, right? Like, because like heritage often it feels like this kind of like gatekeeper kind of project where like a certain number of people are defining actually what heritage is, and if you can't actually talk to them about it, then it just doesn't get there. But then let's just redefine what that term actually means. Let's actually get out there and say like, we're here to collect stories. And again, I'll cite the like one of my favorite projects of recent years actually is the Black Futures on Eglinton project, which was led by Cheryl Case in Little Jamaica out on Eglinton West. Like that whole idea of like, we want to capture, right, and do a cultural mapping exercise of what's really important in this neighborhood. And again, that's a suburban neighborhood. It's not, in any way interesting from an architectural or design perspective, but what is actually here? What are the storefronts that people really enjoy? What are the places that people really love? And I really love that poetry book that came with it. It was just fantastic. And that's the kind of stuff that I would love to see happen all the time, right? And let's also just get away from this whole idea of like these like, like really bland and boring heritage assessments, right? Let's actually talk about like how we can actually capture the live heritage now in a kind of cultural mapping activity. And I think every single project should do that from now on. And that's kind of the place I would love to be at, is that like, this is already happening by the practitioners. This is already happening by the communities. This is already happening. So where are you, City of Toronto? Where are you, other folks in this space, right? Jump on board, right? Come with us, right? This is actually what heritage is.
Thank you so much. So I'm just scribbling notes down. That's what I'm doing over here in the corner as I'm writing. Linda, it is on you. You said you wanted to add something to the conversation. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to like bring this, also zoom out for a moment and kind of coming back to your question on decentering whiteness in heritage, and really come back to this notion of inheritance. Like heritage, like inheritance can only exist if you have this sense of a stable home, a stable homeland, that you have intergenerational legacies that can be passed down or inherited. But it also comes with this sense of there is a right to, say, housing, which is to say that there is a right to be able to legally work and to be employed, to be able to afford housing. These are the kinds of things that inheritance plays as part of, to be born into as a citizen of a country, to feel entitled to the rights to a lot of things that actually most people do not have. And so a lot, I think, of heritage value now is through this lens, and privilege this through this lens. And so sometimes when I think about, like, okay, what would be if I can pass something down to the next generation that they could inherit, like what is that, and what would that look like outside of these frameworks that we already know in terms of rights to certain kinds of property or accumulation of wealth. And so I think there's this common day understanding of heritage as something that protects cultural things or protects certain, like a sense of place or belonging. But belonging is very much founded in this sort of exclusionary act of, like, we protect our own. If you are not one of our citizens, you don't have access to anything. And so if heritage is actually starting from there, it by definition, it has no ability to protect a community's way of life unless that community is the community. And so kind of thinking back to, what would we want to leave to the next generation that also is critical about these practices of inheritance elsewhere.
There's so much here. Chi, it's on you. And then I'm gonna, if it's okay, I might add a couple of words. Then we have one more question I'll ask the whole panelists, and then we'll open up to the audience.
Oh, I will try and do you right and segue it properly. I really want to bring in, like, we're trying to organize on the ground right now. Like, we are trying to interface with the heritage planning system right now. And so, like, right now, there is this one detail that shouldn't be missed, is that people are still materially benefiting from their heritage designations. If you didn't know, you get these grants to, like, paint your house, to, like, upgrade your, like, window shutters. And these are going to historical houses that have been inherited over many generations, where in Rosedale. Actually, our, like, Little Jamaica organizers have this incredible map that has been shared through us, through the amazing, brilliant researcher, Keisha St. Louis McBurney. They made this map that is not yet public, but you can recreate it on your own. You go into the Toronto Open Data Portal, you pull all of the heritage designated buildings. Then behind it, you do a chloropleth of the percentage of the Black population in Toronto by census data. You look at that map and look at where it contrasts. There is no overlap in where that concentration is to heritage to where the Black population lives. It is, like, infuriating, this idea that, like, we could use this kind of public money to do these kinds of, like, repairs for a population or, like, an ownership that does not really fundamentally require it. Can we not just redivert that money into Little Jamaica and ask, like, well, if you can spend it on painting the outside of your fancy house, why can't we get a new HVAC system for a Black-owned business that is, like, struggling in COVID right now? That's something that, like, that's a lesson from them. That's not, like, my brilliance at all. That's, like, completely them and their work. So, like, there is this, like, element that is, like, real and tangible, that there is this, like, usefulness to it. But I think, like, my advice to other organizers would be to, like, the way to think about how to interact with the heritage planning system today is to weigh the emotional labor involved. Like, think about the positionality of your group and think, like, is there a white leadership heritage planning advisory that is citizen-led that could burden that emotional labor for you instead and make that same progress while you focus on other things? Like, just weigh out whether it's worth it. That's where I'll hand it over back to you, Tabiko.
I'm so like I'm smiling from ear to ear. If you all don't mind, if I can share just a couple of brief thoughts that are in coalition with this. The first thing that comes to mind is Linda's notion of heritage as inheritance, which means that heritage is all about property relations. And if we know anything about North America, it is built upon a particular normative property owner, one of whom is, in my mind, at least, white, male, straight, whatever the case may be. And so what we're noticing here is what about folks who are coming here, who in my case, in my tradition, were actually property? Or what do we do with other folks who are coming here and do not have the property or rights or legitimate access to property to therefore designate something as a heritage site? How do we think about this relationship between heritage and property, which is, in my mind, getting back to Erica's question about structuring normative ideas of what heritage is. This gets me to my next question, because Chi, you actually did a great job of segueing us this way. What came to mind, and I believe it was Erica who said, heritage is just a weak tool. And this got me thinking about this Audre Lorde quote, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And I'm wondering, as we transition into this next question, this is my question, how do we think about, for those of us who are on the underside of this question of property and heritage and inheritance, I hear the coalitional possibilities. What are the coalitional possibilities for those of us who are being excluded by heritage practices and not getting access to those material benefits? I leave the floor open. What does it look like for coalitional politics of something that exceeds heritage? And moving forward, I'm going to go back to you, Chi, because you're right here on my screen. But then from there, I'm going to go to Shelly and then open it up moving forward. Sorry, but you just happen to be on my screen, so I'm going to you.
Happy to. Something that we like to say as like a caveat when we talk about doing the community land trust work is that community land trust is a property that is limited within the property system. So if we really believe that abolition is coming, we believe that the time will come, and we don't want to be scared of where our place will be in it when the time comes, we need to divorce ourselves and our identity and our success with the accumulation of property. Like, we can't get to the point where we're advocating for these land trusts and winning this real estate strategy together, cool, in solidarity, great, but like in the real estate system, and then suddenly accidentally advocating for the property system one day, 3 generations later, I'm dead, another Linda Tam exists, she's my granddaughter, she's taken over the land trust, and now she's obsessed with accumulating more property and trying to buy out the entirety of Toronto. That's not the point. So yeah, I would say that that's where it is. And I also want to say that we are constantly, we hear politicians especially talk about Chinatown in the past tense. And there are people who are as if the struggle of Chinatown was a generation ago and that's it. It's just our parents. There are people who are still arriving today. There are people who are making cash dollars undocumented in the back of kitchens in Chinatown. This is a fight that's real, and we can't forget that it's very present tense. Hand it over to Shelly.
I was laughing so hard because I can just see your potential granddaughter and you in heaven being like, what are you doing when you look down on her? I think right now, the pandemic has really exacerbated a lot of things, but there's now evidence that mutual aid is what is supporting our communities. Mutual aid is what has always supported our communities. And we look to, the history of Chinatown, where family associations were the original mutual aid group. And that is kind of a history that FOC really looks back on and is inspired by, and that we try to bring that energy into sort of the activities that we do now, for instance. I think about how this past year, groups like the Encampment Support Network or Vaccine Hunters Canada or Community Fridges Toronto, these are the places that governments who are now realizing their flawed systems, bureaucracies, and incredible ignorance and limitations are looking to for solutions. These are people who are the creative thinkers and how to sort of envision what our futures can live on. And I kind of want to also pivot a little bit to say that our Chinatown in particular is also one that is not just one that is ethnically Chinese folks. There's a large Vietnamese community here. I think about the Continental in Old Chinatown, which was a gathering space for queer women and sex workers. And so the fact that this used to be a neighborhood for folks who weren't accepted into the white straight settler imagination is kind of, again, something that I would like to leave as inheritance for our next generation. For instance, there's such a correlation between who we support now and how they'll exist, if they'll exist in the future. And so Chinatown has always historically served the working class, the underserved, the undocumented and hungry. And I think that this is like the crux of what we need to push forward consistently.
I actually think that is a beautiful, beautiful transition to some Q&As from the audience. Shelley, thank you for bringing all of those powerful ideas up. Linda, I'm relying on you right now. Do you have a couple questions that you want to bring out? I know that I'm going to mispronounce. Is it Hanya or Hannah? Is that correct? I know. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Because there's an IA and I'm not sure. So I don't know. Okay, Hanya. Okay, that's perfect. Thank you so much. There was this incredible question in there, which is one that I'll start us with, which was, how does it, like, what is one thing that Chinatown stakeholders disagree about, is the way that the question was brought up. What is something that all Chinatown stakeholders disagree about? Is that, I think I'm articulating that. Yeah, what is a common ground that all different Chinatown stakeholders often disagree on? Howard, I'm running to you because I think that maybe in terms of grounding, you might have a way of opening this conversation, and perhaps you do or don't have some responses, but I'm throwing it your way. Go ahead.
Straight up, all Chinatown organizers disagree with racism, right, and racial prejudice, and that is, I mean, kind of to state the obvious, but I mean, like, I think it's that is the story, right? Like no matter where we're at, I mean, that story continues even to this day, right? The struggle, the survival, the resistance, right? It's always been part of that narrative, right? So like, I mean, Dragon Center is part of that, right? The many Chinatowns in downtown Toronto are part of that, and we even see that still even today up in newer Chinatowns emerging in the suburbs in Markham and places like that, where there's, and even like, I think recently I heard about Richmond and how people are like, oh, there's too many Chinese signs here, right? Like that's still the same kind of like BS. So I just like, I think it's important that we actually do some more solidarity work to like work together actually as I think as organizers and push against this, and like the sentiments, of course, that are now emerging as part of the pandemic as well, around like Asian hate and things like that. I really want to kind of use these platforms as a way also to talk about that, and to talk about, again, that like how our communities have always been hated on and always been ignored, and we don't want to take that anymore. we're kind of done with that, and I want to tell people that. Yeah.
I super appreciate that power there. I'm wondering, I mean, so Linda, did you want to go for it? Yeah, Hanya, you're absolutely right. Now y'all got me looking in the chat. Racism is a good answer. Like now I'm over here like just sort of invigorated by what's going down. I actually would transition briefly. Erica, do you have anything you want to add to this particular conversation as it relates to what people have in common that they disagree on, so on and so forth?
Well, I think there's a lot that they disagree on, but I think, how do I put this? I think a common ground for people who sort of love Chinatown, who work in Chinatown, who live there, who visit it, I think there's a profound respect for work. Work is like that you are busy, you are doing things, like whatever it is, there's a real sort of smallness to the scale. Like I know Hania asked this question about sort of, the franchises, the chain stores, and then the sphere of the corporations. And the thing is, like in my study of all these North American Chinatowns, there's always this attempt to go big, to go corporate, and it almost invariably fails. It just fails. They're like, we're bringing over the biggest department store from Beijing or Hong Kong, and it's going to like create this massive new complex, and it's going to generate all this money, and we're going to be high-powered people, and it just dies. And there's something about the Chinatown mix. I don't really know what it is. Capitalism is the common ground. It's really just respecting the work. Like, and that's part of the legacy is like, we are working hard, hard, hard. Whether you're an artist, you're a poet, you're an architect, or you're franchising to a boba or a chicken place, like what, you are working hard, right? And there is exploitation for sure. There is a lot of interethnic exploitation and a lot of class divisions, and we need to acknowledge that. But there is also this like real, like when I interview people who are business owners, it's really about the work in the end and thinking about that legacy. And the legacy may not be tied to a place necessarily, and that's interesting, but it is about work. And I think understanding that Chinatown is a place where work can happen, sometimes because there are fewer regulations or hurdles in the way, kind of sort of, you know, greases the wheels, but work is really important, as well as a sense of being kind of a bit of an underdog, right? Which I think connects to what Howard was talking about.
Thank you so much for this. Did anybody else want to hop in before I transition to the next question? Or I love this idea of work. I'm thinking about the distinction between work and labor, and that's a whole nother conversation that we can have later. Did anybody else want to hop in before we transition to the next question? I'm going to take it as y'all are okay with that, because we have a question on, I think we have time for 2 more questions that I would love to hear from everybody on the panel on. And this one comes from Facebook. I'm bringing it up because I want to like shout out to the Facebook folks who are like doing their thing too. It's a way of bringing everyone in. If they had the power, how would the members of the panel rewrite the legal definition of heritage such that it could be a strong tool for community equity and justice rather than something that benefits one specific group? You all have answered this question in part, but let's say you all are in the halls of power, and y'all are, as Toni Morrison says, the definers, not the defined. What would you do? Would you keep this term? Would you abandon it? Would you expand it out? What would be your response? Erica, you're thinking over here, you are ruminating. Is it okay if I come to you to hear your thoughts first?
Oh God, I kind of just don't want it anymore. Especially when I listen to Linda talking about the etymology and sort of this inheritance and this entitlement, and it's all like property. And I'm just like, can we just not have that anymore? I'm over it, Annie. I'm over it. I feel like it's really about empowerment for self-determination, and it has to be people powered. I really like what Chi was talking about. You know, I have a lot of skepticism about land trusts and co-ops because I see them go bad, like, and I see, like, you know, the residents associations, and I've been enough a part of different kinds of community you know, groups to see like power, what happens with power. I think if I could, I would just get rid of it. And I would really think in terms of like, how can we move away from this sort of obsession with property and ownership legally? And mutual aid to me is so fascinating because it is like, it's in economics, we talk about public goods and club goods as sort of, you know, club goods is slightly more limited. And then public goods, which is sort of what we all obsess about, but is like harder to get than we think. And mutual aid kind of like slips in through the cracks and is like, we're something else, right? And I don't know, maybe that's the direction we're heading, I think. And it's just, I agree, it's just like such an obsession with property. And if we're talking about, you know, decolonization, really thinking about what reparations means, like really thinking about it, like, I think we have to, like, to me, heritage is always tied to property. And I think there was a comment in the chat about how heritage is not just about property, but it's also about how it's used. And I fully agree, but unfortunately, the discourse, the framing of it is still fundamentally about property. And that's That's really the problem, because if we really cared about the use of a building, then we would care about who was living in that building and not displacing them, kicking them out, so that we could restore, this rooming house back to its palatial glory of the 1910s. You know what I mean? So that's where I'm at.
Thank you, Shelley. Want to get your thoughts. You hold on to this term. Do you balloon it out? Do you constrict it down? Do you get rid of it? Like I'm in this abolitionist mode after what Erica said, so I'm not going to over-determine the conversation, but I know how I'd answer this question. But I want to hear about from you, Shelley. What are you thinking here?
I agree with Erica. It's an antiquated way and it's a limited framework of thinking. And I think at this point, it's been proven not to serve us, as everybody here has sort of said. And so I don't necessarily think, I'm also tired of trying to think of band-aid solutions and also fixing things on the people in power's terms to fix them. Just thinking of, like, FOCT is a year and a half old, we're still a baby, but thinking of the amount of times that we've been asked to sort of fix inherently flawed policies with an acknowledgement that they're inherently flawed is incredibly frustrating. And so there's momentum to sort of tear things down and rebuild, and I'm all about that.
Thank you, thank you. I'm gonna want to hear from Chi and then Howard, and then I think we're getting close on time, so then we're gonna transition out. But I want to hear from Chi, then Howard, and then we'll have our final words.
Something I'll share as well when trying to think about like what's worth fixing and what isn't. I think like in abolitionist dialogue, we talk about non-reformist reform and reformist reform. And this is a very, very useful concept for people who are wasting their emotional energy on trying to fix the planning system. Like truly, if we were just in charge of everything tomorrow, like it just wouldn't exist. People who feel called to the challenge of planning would be redistributed to other like work that is titled otherwise. And like I think the point that Erica made is good. And I think I would add on top of it that mutual aid isn't without power dynamics itself. Like we're not moving towards this world where like just like power doesn't exist. It's just that like we more responsibly wield it amongst each other. And in the Chinese like history of my family, I do know that the obsession with property ownership is a trauma response. And so I think like that's a lot of healing. That's a lot of healing of being ripped from land. That your family has been intergenerationally dispossessed from one place to the next, burying gold underneath soil and marking it with a tree. Like this is, these are things that like war just like takes several generations to heal. So like I really wish that for our neighborhood in general, but it won't come without time.
Thank you. Howard, it's on you, boss.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to your question, like, or the question, right? Like, the term heritage. I guess I'm someone who's like kind of like a person of action and like, thinking about it in a more of a pragmatic sense. I would say that like we should actually suspend the practice of it in the sense of we should actually like do an actual exercise to actually figure out actually what it is about sort of our past, what it is about our human past that we actually really want to talk about and document and really tell stories about into the future. So I would say, let's suspend heritage for a second. Let's just park it aside. In fact, let's just suspend actually the department as well and all the people that go with it. And actually what instead we should do is like take some money and just spread it out in the community and actually ask community members to actually tell their own story. And let's see what comes out of that, in the sense of there's probably going to be a lot of really interesting heritage ideas, definitions, right? Or heritage ideas and definitions that will come out of that. And I think that will actually allow us then to have a really like fulsome discussion about what all this actually really means to us from that kind of systemic perspective, right? I'm all about sort of systems thinking and like really being able to then go, okay, so like what functionally are we trying to actually do here, and what functionally do we as a city, as a community, as a world really actually want to do to tell the story of what we want in the future. And then at that point we can then actually have a discussion about, we'll bring heritage back and we'll say, so does this definition still work? Should we abolish the word? Should we change it? Should we do whatever, right? That's kind of what I think would be really interesting. So yeah, let's just like start building some like a plethora of grants for like community mapping exercises. And I think actually through that process too, we can actually talk about like health, wellness, actually, and healing. Because actually being able to share these stories with each other, being able to talk about it, being able to walk into a safe space and a positive space and be able to kind of let go of some of these things, right? I think can also help all of us really have a better understanding of what it is we're trying to achieve.
I just want to thank all of you all so much. We are running up on time. I thought we had time for one more question, and I don't think we do. And so I just want to tell you all, I have learned so much from each and every one of you all. As someone who is not a sort of formal member of this community, but someone who is wanting to go into coalitional politics, someone who shares these abolitionist impulses, someone who shares this desire for political transformation that is not simply, as one of the slides said, a kind of boba tea liberalism. We call it Uncle Tom's in our community, right? A certain kind of liberalism that's a problem. And I just want to tell you all, just thank you so much for engaging in this conversation with me, for inviting me to be a conversation partner. If I can just say a couple of words and I transition to you, Linda, I just want to say that for folks who are still on this, if you want to take away a couple of words from what everyone was talking about, I believe one of the big words is futurity. How do we move forward? That's the first word. The second word is healing. How do we heal as we move forward? And maybe the third word is something like imagination or visionaries, something like vision. If we are going to have a vision for the future, if we're going to heal, then what does that look like for us collectively? Mariam Kaba has these three words that she says, and I think I'm going to leave us with this and transition over to Linda. When Mariam Kaba, who's a like really prominent abolitionist activist, she says, when people ask me about abolition, I have these three sentences. We can do abolition, we must do abolition, and we are doing abolition. And it seems to me that the work that's happening right here comes back to those three sentences. We can, we must, and we are. Thank you all so much. Linda, it is on you to do your thing, to close us out.
Thank you so much, Biko, for those incredible closing remarks and moderating this panel. I think as we're coming to a close, I actually just want to return back to actually where we started this call from, which is to acknowledge our land. This conversation is really about the politics around being allowed to occupy public space, to be the right to property, to land, to space, but also a different framework around how we might think about not fighting over all of our different rights and who has more rights, but rather a different form of sharing space, sharing land, holding space in community, and how we might care for one another through our care for that land and that sharing. So for all of you in the audience, thank you so much for joining. Those of you still here who have stayed till the end of this 2-hour Zoom event. Wow, I am so impressed. Thank you for sharing in this space with us. And thank you so much to all of our panelists today, Shelly, Chi, Howard, Erica, co-moderator Biko. Thank you so much for sharing and all of your insights and this incredible conversation. It's a very busy time of year. We really appreciate sharing in this time. Sharing is not just land and property. It's many, many things. It's care, it's emotion, it's time, it's space. So to sharing, thank you so much, everybody.